The citizens should be able to find absolutely everything they want to know about every part of the city, whether it's elected officials or hired officials, and what they're doing.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The Grand Failure Beyond the Streets.
Hello and welcome back to the Grand Failure Beyond the Streets podcast. I'm your host, Rebekah Massie, and today, instead of talking about traffic or other issues within our city of Surprise, I am going to talk about something that is in season. And no, I don't mean Christmas in July. What I do mean is election 2024. So for those of you who don't know, in less than 2 weeks, on July 30th, our city has election day. Now, you may be thinking, Rebekah, that's the primary election, right? Yes. For just about everything else in the state, it is the primary election. You are correct. However, for our city, we actually vote for new council members, the next mayor, and even vote to ratify, or whether or not to ratify, I should say, the 2040 general plan, all on that primary ballot. So that means that unless for some reason there is a need for a runoff election on the November ballot for the mayoral race, for instance, since that's the only contested election, we will know exactly who will be at the helm early next year once they get sworn into office, which is some pretty exciting stuff, if you ask me. And to honor that, I wanted to actually get a chance to speak with the candidates directly and interview them. So each of the next 4 episodes, so episodes 7, 8, 9, and 10, respectively, of the Grand Failure podcast, will feature an exclusive interview with one of the candidates that's running for office currently within our city. Before I introduce this episode's guest, I'd like to go over just a few things. For those of you who don't know, or maybe this is your first time tuning in, hi, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. I am very big as a person on transparency. And I'm going to go over the ground rules and kind of lay all of my cards on the table, so to speak, as far as how I communicated with the candidates and how I let them know these interviews would be conducted. And that way, you know, when I play the recording here in a few moments, exactly how all of this went down, right? I'm a relatively informal person, so we did these interviews remotely. The questions were given to the candidates ahead of time. Each candidate received the same list of questions. I also did extend an invitation to every single person running for office, all 6 of them. And you may be saying, hey, Rebekah, you said 4 episodes a minute ago. You're right. I did. I had 2 individuals hold out. I did try. And again, everybody got the same messages. Everybody got the same questions. Everybody got the same spiel, so to speak, from me as far as how we were going to go about this. And I'm sharing this with you just so that way you, as my listeners, and more importantly, if this gets shared around a little bit more, since we're talking candidates and election, that the overall community of Surprise would understand the thought process behind this and the care that I took to ensure that, despite my personal opinions, that I was going to conduct these interviews in a very nonpartisan manner. It would be not interjected either consciously or unconsciously with my own biases or opinions, political views, etc. And that you, the community at large, right, has the opportunity to get a feel for who these individuals in our community are that are seeking public office, what their platform is, their experience, their vision for the city, right? And most importantly, even though we have a couple of different types of races going on, right? All of our city council seats have elections that are running unopposed. So these folks are likely going to get elected, right? They're the only option on the ballot. But in interviewing them, it gives a look into maybe somebody who hasn't had much of an opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with these folks, or if maybe these folks don't even represent your district that you live within, the council is a governing body, right? There's 6 city council members, one for each of the districts. And then there's the mayor, total of 7 persons on this body. They work together. And being able to see how the different pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, or the different individuals within this group of people operate individually and how they view the team as a whole is going to be very insightful as to the direction our city is headed here in the next few years. And then for the contested race, i.e. the mayoral race for our little city here, not so little anymore, if for some reason you are on the fence of the 2 candidates I was able to get to interview with me, hopefully this will help clear things up on where they stand and be able for you to compare a little bit more apples to apples versus what you see kind of pushed out on social media, what you see in the local papers, and so forth. All right, so hopefully I'm not getting too terribly redundant with the disclaimers, trying to keep it basically the same recording for all 4 of them so you guys can see exactly what's behind the curtain. Now that that's out of the way, allow me a moment to introduce today's guest. Today, I have on the show the interview that I had with Mr. Ed Cunningham. Now, Mr. Cunningham is one of 3 candidates that's running in our city's mayoral election. Mr. Cunningham is running as a write-in candidate. For those who don't know what that means, it's pretty self-explanatory. It means his name is not printed on the ballot, which means as you go to cast your ballots, if you want to place your vote for Ed, you'll need to go below the other 2 candidates, bubble in the write-in option, and write in his name, which is spelled Ed, E-D, and then his last name is Cunningham, once again, which is Cunningham, Ed Cunningham. Now that I've kept you all waiting long enough, I suppose, let's dive right into this interview with Mr. Cunningham. Let's actually get into why I invited you onto the show here. So the first question is, can you share with me your qualifications and experience relevant to taking on a role in our local city government? And how do your qualifications compare to that of your opponent?
Okay, that's a great question. So there's a lot of things that I bring to the table, just off of my merits. One, having built a 7-figure company that was 7-figure a year revenue generating company here in Surprise that was actually a real community hub. Our Firehouse Subs restaurant was one of the highest grossing in the nation. We had about 62,000 people a year come through the door, generated more than $1.5 million a year in income, paid out over $3 million in pay to local residents. We've been a big part of the community for a while, but a lot of what I've done has been behind the scenes, whether it was charity work, whether it was mediating between resident groups in the city. I have great relationships that you can't build overnight. You just can't. These are relationships that have been built well over a decade and have made me very effective behind the scenes. When I first thought about running, it was quite a few people asked me to run for this next election right now, but they asked me a few years ago. And I had thrown my name out there. I talked to some of the council members I respect, the mayor, some of the business owners here who I have a great relationship with, the business community, obviously. And all of them was talking about me running. Well, one of my friends who I've known since high school is on the council, and he asked me to back him, and I did, because he has projects that he's working on. And I was getting ready to start working on selling the restaurant and bringing another large venue to Surprise. He threw it on me. So I was planning on running years ago. And I'll be honest with you, if I had more time, I will not commit to something that I don't know 100% I can do. And the last thing I wanted to do was commit to running for mayor and then find out that my other commitments that I had already made would interfere with it and then have to choose between them. So I went back to my investors and my partners who were working on me with the venue and completely rearranged my entire life, because this job, the office of mayor, needs a full-time person that has the network that I have, which is large, that has the abilities that I have and the experience that I have. So my experiences are in business for a very long time. I've sat down with millionaires and billionaires. I've negotiated, multi-million-dollar deals with big lots for distribution. I've even done manufacturing overseas. I've sat down with these people. And in the next few years, with the projects that we have coming that need good negotiators, that is something that I bring to the table that I'm not going to say the other candidates can't, but they can't do it, and they haven't done it to the level that I have so far in my life. So I bring that. The business community, the ideas that I have for being able to help the mom and pops, as well as still encourage the big box from coming here responsibly. The relationships that I have with developers. I've worked with developers over the years. I've helped negotiate leases for some of the small businesses here in Surprise. So I've built these relationships, and they're built on respect. And that is something that is absolutely paramount that we have in the office of mayor, especially over the next 4 years with the growth that we're looking at. Because we can't have these developers come here just to make money off of us. You know what I mean? Because they have land. We have to, ahead of time, because we're facing some of this now. Some of the decisions that were made 15, 20 years ago, we're trying to negotiate through those now, because they didn't have the foresight back then when the decisions are made. Well, now we do. So my goal as mayor, the two biggest thing I'm going to handle is trying to help negotiate through some of the issues that we have now. And I'll throw out like the idea of the Dominion project, right? I think the Dominion project should have been built somewhere else in the city. Back when it was approved 15 years ago, though, this was the outer edges of the city, out where we're at now. And I would much rather have seen a negotiation of land swap instead of us trying to fight it from going through. Because the problem was we had no legal precedence to fight it. Whether you agreed with it, emotionally, mentally, or whatnot, it didn't matter. We did not have the legal right. And the government should not have such power to tell you everything to do with your land, especially after it's been approved. Does that make sense? Did I like the project? No. Do I think there's better places for it to be built? Absolutely. But if we had strong-armed the mayor and the city council into voting no against an already approved project, zoning already approved, we would have opened ourselves up for tens of millions of dollars. Some people have estimated up to $50 million in liabilities. And that is it would have been completely irresponsible. So whether you like the project or not, totally moot point. The fact that it was already approved, we have to stick through. That's where a good mayor can sit down with developers who has relationships with developers and go, all right, look, I know you got this land over here. This is where we'd rather have it. How do we work out that you guys can do a land swap? We can make sure that your zoning is approved over here. Like, that's where someone who knows how to negotiate and find win-wins is extremely important. And it's going to be even more important over the next 4 years as these developers, as we start annexing more of our city planning area, we need someone who knows how to bring people to the table. And that's something that I've got in spades.
No, and I think those are a lot of really good call outs. And I wasn't going to go out of order on these, but you kind of mentioned the Dominion project. And so I do have a question on here. Sure. It's the 8th question. And that question is, if you're familiar with that referendum that was run by the Political Action Committee, or PAC, Voice of Surprise, which was against, of course, we know the council's decision on an apartment complex in District 3 by Dominion. You kind of already elaborated on what your thoughts are on that matter. I want to know how you would have voted, or if there's anything additional you would like to add. And would your lens then have changed? Like, basically, if you would have voted, say, yes, then would you still vote yes now, or vice versa?
No, that's a great question. So when it first started, and so the group Voice of Surprise, they're actually my neighbors. I live here in Sarah Ann Ranch. These are all my neighbors. And I was approached by some of the people heading that up, and they said, hey, Ed, would you mind using your influence? And can we use your restaurant to gather signatures? And again, I'm one of those that before I commit to something, I have to make sure I know all sides of it, and so that I can make the right choice. I'm not just going to go off of my emotions and just run headlong into something. So I said, well, give me a few days. I need to make some phone calls. So I called and I spoke to people I respect at the city. They have a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. I got a lot of information out of it. And that was when I realized that legally we couldn't vote no. Okay. So what I did was, even before I reached back out, is I went to the county, I went to the state and the contacts that I had there. I went to some judges that I knew to see, okay, is there any legal precedence for being able to, do a referendum, to be able to put an emergency stop on this? I did a ton of research, and it all kept coming back to, if they try to change their zoning, then you can do something. But if they stick to the already approved zoning, there is legally nothing you could do on the state level, on the federal level, on nothing. So again, I wasn't for the project personally, right? And this is why it's important to have, this is something very important to have as an elected official. Even though I didn't want the project where they wanted to build it, the city had no legal right to tell them no if they stuck to the zoning and the planning that was already approved. Does that make sense? And as a city official, it would have been completely irresponsible to vote no. because you have to be able to set your personals aside and do what's right for the city. And again, doesn't matter whether you like the project or not, it would have been irresponsible for an elected official to vote no and create that big of a liability for the city. So I would have voted no back then, and I would vote no today.
And that makes sense.
I'm sorry.
I knew what you meant. You would have voted against the referendum in favor of the project because of the risks. I got you.
Yeah, not because I was for the project or I like the idea of it, but because legally there was nothing we could do. I'm not going to, for the sake of ego, cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. It's just irresponsible.
I mean, me personally, I think it's a bad place for that project too. In my understanding, I haven't done a whole in-depth analysis on the Dominion project, but from my understanding is like the technicality, if you will, or kind of the issue at hand that caused the referendum to fail despite the numerous appeals process were the fact that it was an administrative change where they were applying for like a variance within zoning and not necessarily a change in zoning in and of itself. And so despite there being legal precedents for referendums, there wouldn't have been a good case law example, say, of overturning a decision like this.
And that's exactly what the judges that I talked to told me. That was their counsel, and I respected them on that. And first off, I love the fact that my neighbors stepped up and became the voice of Surprise. Like we need more of that. And that was my counsel when I went back. They weren't happy with me when I said, no, I'm not going to back you. I can't put energy into something that I don't believe is right. Again, I didn't like the project. I don't like where it's being built. But I told them, I said, the problem is we have all these decisions that were made years ago. We need the voices now to be looking to the future, to what's going on now. And I love that group has turned their sights towards, all right, how can we keep this from happening again? Because we need, you talked about transparency. I'm 100% with you on that. And part of transparency that often gets left behind is the availability of information to the residents being easy to obtain. I do like our website. It's not a bad website, but to try and find some of the information, there's been times I've been looking for information on things for a half hour and I still have no idea where I'm at on the website. So we need to we need more residents to step up. We had 249,000-ish people living here in Surprise. Only 27,000 voted in the last mayoral election.
It was I think a total of 31,000 total, but maybe there were only 27,000 votes for the mayor. Like
less than 10%. So it's like, how do we, and this is something I want to challenge as mayor, challenge myself to do as mayor, is to be able to get people to be involved. And part of that is making it simpler on them to be involved. We do have the city boot camp or whatnot where you can come in and learn about how the city runs.
The academy. I think the issue with that though is usually it's not conducive to a working person to join.
Yes.
You have to rearrange your schedule, because I would personally like to do it because I know that there's more. I'm really good at what I like to call intensive Googling and figuring out information. But, and you're right about the website. I mean, as somebody who dabbles in web development, I joke, obviously joking. I'm like, man, whoever developed that website needs to be taken out back and shot. Because it's just I don't feel like it's user friendly whatsoever.
No, it was.
I think the GUI or the graphical interface of it, the design and color scheme and visuals are fine. I think that what it lacks is some of the organizational, the architecture, and it seems like they don't have a safeguard in place where if they change the slug at the end of whatever the URL is, it'll automatically update. And so you wind up with dead links. Even on somebody recently pointed out on, I think it was Nextdoor or Facebook, one of the two, that the It's Your Money that's supposed to be available on the city financial and city auditor webpage is dead in the water. And it's been dead in the water for a couple of months. Because I was looking at it when I was digging into the tax increase and everything like that, which just tells me that whatever back-end database or what have you, we're not checking our work when we're pushing something to production.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a website guru, but I know enough about it to get me in trouble and to come up with some good ideas, though.
That's fair. So we'll pivot back to kind of a little bit more about you specifically. So what initially motivated you to pursue a role in government?
So I got to be clear. I'm not a politician. I'm blunt. I'm not mean, but I've got no problem calling a spade a spade. And that has served me well as a business owner, as a community leader in the background. And I'm fantastic at building bridges, but I will not cow to people. I don't care how much money someone has. I don't care what they think they can bring to the city. I'm not going to let them, take advantage of the city. Here, I'll tell you really what what threw my hat in the ring. I'd been asked for years to run. People have asked me, will you run for council? Will you run for, the mayor? Will you? And I thought about it. I kept saying, no. Like, I'm really effective behind the scenes because I have great relationships with everyone. I can't be seen as one side or the other. And so I'm good to be effective. So when I was in the military, my father would write me a letter once a month. And at the top of every letter, he would put a quote from someone. And one of the times he sent me a letter, the quote at the top, and it's always stuck with me since I was 19 years old, was by Edmund Burke. And it said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but it said, all evil needs to succeed is for good men to do nothing. And meeting with some of the people that are elected officials now, one of them who I respect a lot, was pushing me to run for mayor. And I told him, I don't like politicians. I don't like politics. And he goes, the problem with politics is that good men have sat back and the only people running are the ones that want to hurt others. And he goes, it's time for good people to step up. And I went immediately right back to that quote that my father had sent me, is all evil needs to succeed. And that was it for me. That was a couple of years ago. And that's when I made the decision I was going to run, or at least I was going to step up and be more involved in politics. I was planning on running for mayor. And then that's when my friend and I went out and had coffee and talked about, and it wasn't like we just talked once and I made the decision to back him. We met several times and we talked about the long-term plans and I totally agreed with what he wanted to accomplish as mayor. And that's why I threw my backing behind him. But I was still going to step up into the political ring no matter what. Unfortunately, I didn't get my life rearranged enough to where I could commit to it until after the signatures were due. Because I'll be honest with you, if I was on the ballot, this would be a totally different race. The only issue anyone has with me running is that I'm a write-in candidate. And that's all they can come up with, because that's which, even like you said, it's really a small deal. People are like, oh, you're taking the easy way out. No, running as a write-in is the harder way to do it. But me getting 1,000 signatures.
Yeah, it's kind of like a cat and mouse or a chicken egg situation when you talk about a write-in, where it's the easy way out as far as you didn't have to go and do boots on the ground for signature collecting, but you're at a disadvantage because you're not on the ballot and people are going to have to remember to check. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like if you're talking about objectively, right? Yeah. Or, because you're not on the ballot, right? People are going to have to look at who the write-ins are and then remember to go and underneath where they're going to see Klein and Sartor bubble in and then write, Ed Cunningham.
That's why our signs are, I don't know if you saw the signs.
Right in. No, I've definitely seen them, especially the 4x8s or what have you.
Yeah, that's so weird to me to still see. Picture out there. That's just not me, but
it's been weird too, like a couple of the times, because I think you and I are similar in the sense that I'm not a limelight person either, despite what people may think. So the next question that I have is if you can summarize the key points of your campaign platform.
So first and foremost, it's to help negotiate through and build bridges through any of the old issues that we have, such as like the Dominion project. That's not going to be the only issue we're going to have with decisions that were made 15, 20 years ago. So my job is to build the relationships that we can so that we can, again, do something better with a land swap. Be able, if you don't have the relationships, you can't make things like that happen. So the first thing I'm going to be doing when I get in is to figure out, all right, let's look at the next 5 years. How many pre-approved plans are we going to have issues with? And how do we head those issues off so they don't turn into the fiasco like the Dominion did? Does that make sense? And part of that's going to be engaging the residents in this ahead of time. So it's not reactionary, but it's proactionary. Along that lines, the same thing is it's also, like I said earlier, is the negotiating towards the future. We have to, and we do have a great looking plan with the 2040 plan. I'm all about pushing to finish annexing the rest of our city planning area as quickly and as fiduciary responsibly as we can. There's some like here's an important thing that we need. This is another reason why we need a good leader and a good mayor. Is most people don't know this, but one of the biggest complaints I hear from residents is why are we so far behind on our infrastructure? Especially extending out our roads like Greenway and Waddell and Cactus and whatnot. Well, the reason being is because at the state level, because some of the things we do we can't make happen at the city level, we can only influence at the state level to be able to affect us. Does that make sense? So, like, for instance, there's a state law that only allows a city to put a lien on land for 10 years. So a lot of the stuff that we did 10 years ago that we tried to get ahead on, the developers just sat on the land for 10 years and the lien fell off. So we weren't reimbursed for that. So I want to change at the state level that law so that we can put indefinite liens on land. And that's going to do two things. One, that's going to stop developers from waiting for 10 years. So they're going to actually jump more into the development earlier. And two, it's only going to attract developers who genuinely care about investing in Surprise. It's going to push the ones that are just here to make a buck. It's going to start pushing them out. And it'll allow us to invest in the future, knowing that we're going to recoup it eventually, no matter what. So there's things like extending 163rd all the way up to 74. And that's a 303 question, actually. Yeah, there's so many things that I know the city would love to be able, and the residents could use right now, the investment in infrastructure. But if we can't recoup that, it doesn't make financial sense. It's a bad ROI. So those are the two main things: the dealing with the issues of the past, trying to correct them through relationship building and negotiating, and working to make sure that those mistakes don't happen again as we move forward with our growth. My other main focus is going to be on small business. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of small business. It is the backbone of every single city. I will absolutely breathe the brick wall against the federal government or the state if I have to, when it comes to protecting our small businesses here in Surprise. I want to see the Tech Accelerator program actually function the way that it's supposed to. And that's we could spend an hour talking about the ideas for that. I want to bring, especially our older population, like our Sun City Grands and festivals, and these people that have decades of life experience and business experience and CEO experience and investment experience, and bring them more into a Tech Accelerator type program to be able to mentor these young entrepreneurs who are building the businesses within Surprise. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, it increases the tax revenue and increases, people wanting to come to Surprise. It makes the feel of Surprise better, and it keeps that small town feel going. But it will also encourage good people who want to start businesses to come to Surprise, especially if they know they can draw on that wealth of knowledge. So that's another program I want to work very closely with. Very small business friendly. First responders, obviously, having been a firefighter and a paramedic myself, very passionate about our first responders. To me, it's all about training. It's all about equipment, and it's about being fiduciary responsible as well. Now, I was very active in our association and our union, but I wasn't always the most popular guy, because I don't believe in strong arming. Same thing with the Dominion Project. I don't believe in trying to strong arm council or hired, people like the city manager to do what you want. So I'm all about doing what's right, regardless of who wants. And one of the things I want to see resident involvement is one of the things I'm going to be pushing big time for, especially when it comes to our first responders. There's a lot that we can do more with volunteers.
No, I think that's all great. Definitely good to hear directly from you versus, what you see slung around in social media. I think that this next question kind of segues into this. So I know you've mentioned several times, right, resident involvement. Mm-hmm. So since it seems like the city and the residents really only get involved in a reactive sense versus a proactive sense, what are the three most important issues you think that our city is facing today, and how do you plan to address them?
When you're saying issues that we're facing, are you talking about like actual contentious issues that are already contentious, or ones that are possibly
just anything in general, however you want to interpret it? What do you think the three, like if I was like, hey Ed, what are the top three threats or problems, whether it's existing contentions, things that maybe you see on the horizon that other people aren't seeing, whatever you think are the three most important things?
I think number one, and is the reason most of us moved here, was that kind of small town family feel that Surprise gave you, even though it still had kind of the bigger city amenities. Resident involvement is going to be huge in keeping that feel. Does that make sense? When you have residents that just kind of disappear to their neighborhood and they don't really take part in anything, you lose that small town feel, especially as you grow. The BNSF is going to be a very contentious one. And again, this is, I've heard a lot of people slinging mud at the city because of BNSF. And I've tried to explain to them, so I'll just throw it out there now. There's not a lot we can do besides influence with that, because it's not within the annexed city. It's not ours. So that's the reason why the BNSF did reach out to the city and talk to us. And we were like, hey, we're against some of the things that you're thinking about doing. So what'd they do? They're like, well, you guys haven't annexed this land yet, so we're going to go to the state and purchase the water rights, which they did. They bought the water rights. They now own the water rights to that area. And what are they doing for their permitting? They're going through the county, because technically it's a county island. That's one of the reasons for us to annex as much of the land as possible. But again, this is where resident education and involvement is important, because a lot of people are slinging mud at the city going, why aren't you guys stopping this? Why aren't you doing this? And it's like, well, we can't. That's not what the city can do. It's not within the city limit. Most of the breakdowns that I've seen happen between citizen groups and the city was from really just lack of understanding. And that's a responsibility of the city as well. I mean, the residents do have to take the responsibility to step up and seek the knowledge, but the city has to do a great job of allowing that knowledge to be easily accessible to the citizens, anything they want. Again, back to transparency. The citizens should be able to find absolutely everything they want to know about every part of the city, whether it's elected officials or hired officials, and what they're doing as far as the jobs they're doing. So we've got, again, like I said earlier, the old things that were approved that we're going to have to negotiate through or do our best to, and at least have influence on, being able to work with people like the BNSF. I mean, it's, we're talking billionaires here who really don't live anywhere near Arizona. And how do we work with them to be able to build something to allow them to build what they need to build without damaging us? Because I know you're a big champion for the 303 and Grand fiasco and getting that fixed. Well, here's the problem. When BNSF gets built out, it's going to add almost 80,000 trucks a day.
I know. And it's funny that you mentioned the mud getting slung at the city, because over 6 months ago, when the pressure that I was able to apply essentially sped up the restriping, because that's what happened, is I created links on my website.
And thank you for that. We
inundated everyone and their mama at ADOT with emails, and they wanted them stopped. And I was like, come fight me, basically. Lloyd Abrams got up and was talking at Nick Haney's constituent meeting right before the Christmas holiday. And somebody asked about BNSF. And he was like, well, we're still in talks. We don't know if they're going to annex or not, or this, that, and the other thing. And I had found, like a couple weeks before that meeting, an article from, I think it was like 2020 or 2022. It was definitely a few years old, back in December. And I said, okay, so sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to shout out this question because it's pertinent to what's happening right now on the floor. What is your opinion, or what are your thoughts on BNSF literally saying, if the city doesn't bend to whatever they want, they're just going to go straight to the county? And Lloyd's like, I don't know what context that's in. And I'm like, how do you not know? Like, how do you not know? Why do I know this and you don't? Like, I'm a private resident who literally at that point had been involved for about a month, like less than 30 days. I'm like, why am I more informed than you, sir? So it's, I think there's, in the city's defense, I think you have a point of not slinging the mud at the city, but at the same time, if the city's not plugged in enough to know that is what BNSF has gone on record and said, they should have been starting to, like you said, I'm going to pull one of your lines, right? Building bridges and sort of having those conversations, because had we had those conversations and been proactive versus reactive, we would be in a far better planning and zoning position for that piece of property that's something like 4,000.
Yeah, that is one of my goals, especially in the first 2 years as mayor, is to figure out what we need to be heading off to keep these things from happening. Because otherwise, we're just going to be constantly playing catch up and constantly being reactive.
And we are.
Yeah. And my goal in the first 2 years is to get us out of reactionary mode into proactionary mode for the future, and still on the things that we have to be reactionary to, do that in a more effective way. Less contention, but more effective.
No, and I would agree. And so this actually is this is why I was like, I don't want to go out of order on stuff, because as you can see, like, stuff's kind of segueing into it. But so I'm going to kind of pair up 5 and 6 just for the sake of time. So 5 is, what do you feel should be the role of government? And then 6 is talking about how the city has faced some difficult situations in the past several years. How do you think that the city can go about repairing their brand and public opinions about them?
No, that's great. So I'll start with the role of government, and I'm going to be completely real with you. I am a proponent for small government. The government's job is not to solve problems. The government's job is to get out of the way of the problem solvers and let them solve the problems. The free market can solve most of the needs and all of the wants of the residents. If residents want a pool, then okay, how many residents actually want the pool? You know what I mean? Like, do we set,
right, the HOA could build it, for example.
Right. A free market person who lives here in Surprise, who is passionate about pools and can build the pool and charge people to go there. And then the people that go there are the ones that are paying for it. The people that want it are the ones paying for it, and not spread out across the backs of everybody in the city. And that's just an example. I am all for limited government, and along with limited government comes less taxes, because you have less need for taxes. I would be a big proponent of this. Again, the small business idea is to pushing things into the free market and looking into the free market for solutions. Someone once asked me a question. They said, hey, what would you do if you're president of the United States? And I said, I'll be real with you. I never want to be president of the United States. the president should mostly be just a figurehead that works on international things. Our federal government is 100 times bigger than it ever should have been. And the highest office I would ever go to, and it's not that I'm pushing for it, because believe me, I don't like being out here doing this, is the governor of Arizona. And as the governor of Arizona, I would push for small, limited government. I would take away the citizens paying federal income tax and make it a state income tax. I would take away federal land from the federal government, make them into state parks instead of federal parks. And I would put us back to the republic that we were meant to be. That is, I absolutely believe in the Constitution and what it stands for and what it still should stand for, and not weird interpretations of it. We are about, the government is about serving the people. I'm about term limit. Yeah, I'm about limiting, and that's the only way. You leave the money in the pockets of the people will decide where they want to spend their money. The idea that the government should take everything from everyone and then redisperse it the way they want to is one of the biggest lies and one of the biggest detriments to everything from our economy to our way of life. It was Reagan that said, what was it? The 8 worst words you could hear is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And that my goal would be to get out of the way and allow the citizens to run it the way they want it run. And they vote with their wallet, where they want to spend their money. Instead of us taking the money as the government and redistributing it where we think it should go, people should keep it in their pockets, and they should choose which charities to support, which businesses to support, which projects to support. And I mean, obviously there's a lot more to it than just that. And what was the second part of the question?
So the second part, and I appreciate your answers on that. I mean, I've disclosed this on my podcast and publicly. I'm a libertarian, so like the more that we can decentralize and the less bureaucracy we have is a win in my book. Also getting away from the duopoly, but that's a whole other ball of wax as it pertains to party implosions in the presidential election.
Oh, we could do a whole
I know I could. There's so many things that I should just start doing TED Talks on. Not that anybody would probably listen. But the second part of the question was in regards to with the role of government and specifically the city government. We faced a lot of really difficult situations in the past several years. Dominium is one. 303 and Grand is another, and so forth. What do you feel that the city can do to start repairing their brand and changing public opinion about them when it comes to whether it's transparency, accusations of corruptions, not working with best interests, or any of the negativity that you see?
This to me honestly comes back to transparency again, because there's really two sides of transparency. There's the, hey, let's make sure anything that could possibly be ugly does see the light, because everything's less ugly when it's out in the light. But the other thing is, and this is where the city can do so much better, is the positive PR, the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that people don't hear about. So I'll tell you a great story. When we were working on the new games park over in Old Town Center, right? When they were tearing down the old ball field and getting ready to build the new ball field, one of the grandchildren of the original gentleman that donated the land and built that ballpark reached out to me and said, I need your help. I'm really upset. I need to fight the city on this. And I said, well, okay, let's get together. So we got together and had coffee, and it was, she was very visibly upset. She was, because this was her childhood. She grew up here. Her grandfather donated the land and built the ballpark. And the city, when she first reached out to the city has a big heart that they just don't let the public see very often. But they were like, hey, we're sorry, but this has been 2 years in the project. We've had countless council meetings about it. It's gone through planning and zoning. This is already a done deal. Well, sitting down and talking with her, what I found out personally was that what had really upset her was the first day of demolition, as she drove by, the plaque that was made with her grandpa's name on it and a bunch of other things that emotionally meant a lot to her was just shoved in the dirt with fence and stuff as it was all kind of being bulldozed. And that broke her heart, rightfully so. Now, the city didn't do anything wrong. She didn't do anything wrong, but she had so much hurt over what she saw that she was kind of lashing out at the city about it. And the city worker that she had talked to had become very defensive, and they weren't mean back. They were actually very professional, but they were just like, hey, there's nothing we can do about this. This is 2 years. You kind of should have showed up to council meetings, which isn't what someone wants to hear when they're upset. So what ended up happening was...
No, it also doesn't help that the council doesn't do a great job of publishing the agendas or pushing them out either, because that just...
For sure.
Compounds the issue.
Yes, we need to be better about that. I want live broadcasts every time. There's so many other changes that we're gonna do to make it more readily available to the public. So I ended up calling someone in the city that I had a great relationship with, and I let them know, hey, this is what happened. This was her experience. Because whoever had talked to her originally didn't stop to listen to her experience, because the solution was right there. And I told told my friend at the city, I said, this is what's going on. She's really upset because she drove by and saw everything buried in the dirt. So what the city did, and this is the stuff that the city doesn't talk about, because most of the people that are serving in the city as elected officials or even as employees do have a heart, and they're kind of like me, and they don't care about being in the spotlight or getting the recognition for it. But what they did is they sent city workers over there to the construction site, and they spent hours digging through the dirt, pulling out everything they could that they thought might meant something to the family, took it back to the main area where we have storage for the city, and did their best to fix and clean up everything. And then they delivered it to her house. Those kinds of stories, again.
Why wasn't that published anywhere is my question. Like, I know that you don't necessarily need the clout for it, but that they could have just not dropped names and just published something. Like, I would have seen that and been like, wow.
I agree, and I don't have a ready solution for that. But what I can tell you is the reason why.
To be fair.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why they don't do it is because I'll be honest, I have great relationships with a lot of the city employees and especially the elected officials. Most of them are not out for themselves. Most of them do a lot behind the scenes that isn't published, that isn't talked about. And so you get this almost cold feeling about these people, but each one of them are real people with families. And again, I think there's some PR that can be done there so that you feel like, and this will help with keeping the small town feel, you feel like your city council members, your mayor personally, your city manager, your parks and rec people. And you know what I mean? Like that's, I would like to see, honestly, I haven't said this before, but I'm going to throw it out there. One of my ideas when I become mayor is to actually do at least a bi-weekly podcast where I can invite people from the city to come on and tell these stories, to talk about the issues, to talk about, what they're dealing with.
Or even just repurpose some of the surprise TV stuff, like let the two girls do the interview. You know what I mean? Like there's things that can be done. And I think you're right. I think people do forget a lot of times that there's a human element. And as much as I love to light a fire under people's asses, like even though I've gone toe to toe with Nick Haney, who represents me over in District 1, like I can still, when we're not in an official capacity and I'm not being like, hey, you contradicted yourself right here, or hey, you voted for something and I don't like it, because he's at the start of his parenting journey and I have 3 kids, the youngest of which is 3.5, about to turn 4 in November. Like I was right where he was not too long ago. And I've had some really good conversations with he and his wife about just, like he had shared with me one time, he's like, I feel completely useless because she's breastfeeding at the present. And he's like, I feel like I'm just up. And I said, like, the best thing you can do is literally just get up with her, change the kid's diaper, hand the baby to her, let her feed the baby. I said, stay up with her, turn on an episode of something, like who cares? I said, and just make sure she's got plenty of water, electrolytes, and snacks she can eat with one hand. Like that's the best thing that you can do.
I remember those.
Right. And it's not, but those are the conversations that, even though that's a relatively benign thing that he and I were talking about, is just family. And based on what you're telling me, there's a ton of other little pockets of things that go on where even just preserving that plaque, right, for that family is huge, or as we get to, like, I know Ken Renly had added an agenda item or positioned a future agenda item a few council meetings back, and he was talking about doing something to kind of preserve or memorialize the original town site. And I said, I think that's great. I said, one thing that I enjoyed living in Charleston, South Carolina area for about 2 years before moving back to Arizona in 2018 was you could go down to the pier and everything, and you could look out and you could see Fort Sumter, right? You could also go, there was so many museums that were either free or very, very, very low cost, where it was literally everything from Civil War, Revolutionary War, history of South Carolina and Charleston as a territory, its first days in statehood, and everything. And I said, we should have something like that. And I think that every city should have, because if you don't have history, then you're kind of doomed to repeat the mistakes from it. But
sure. And we don't have a lot of history. Actually, the weird thing is we are creating the history of Surprise right now. There is the original town site and the families that helped build the foundation of Surprise. Litchfield Park does a really good job. They have a house that was donated to them that was turned into a small museum I absolutely love. It's right at the corner of Camelback and Litchfield Road. I've always pictured, something like that people can still at least go visit and get the history of Surprise. I remember hunting.
And it doesn't have to be huge. And that's honestly what some of the museums are. I don't know if you've ever been to downtown Charleston, it's literally like practically a shack where you look at it and you're like, a hurricane is totally going to take this thing out one day. I'm sure of it, especially if they get like another Hugo or something. But like, it's just like a house or like a duplex or something that they've knocked the walls down and made into a little museum of whatever type of a thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of options that we can do.
And it's not that hard. So there's only a couple questions left. Speaking of kind of repairing the brand and whatnot, in your opinion, and if the decision were entirely up to you, what would you do to help solve the budget deficits that the city is facing? And I guess kind of the silent part of that is, how would you position that to the average resident so that they're not mad at you?
Yeah, well, that's you're not. First off, you're not going to make everybody happy. It's just you can't, and to even try so would be a waste of energy. You got to do what's best for everyone that you possibly can. And again, when you only have 10% of the population stepping up to vote and actually take part in it, it's hard to get across what everyone in the city actually wants. Remember the question again? Sorry, I was starting to go off on a bunny trail.
No, you're good. It was about the deficit that the city is facing. So, obviously the city made the decision now to increase the sales tax. So what would you have done if it were solely up to you? And how do you think that would play into public perception?
So I'll address this kind of on two fronts. I agree with the vote on the council, and it was unanimous. No matter what other people have said that they voted against it, they lied. It was unanimous. It needed to happen the way it needed to happen for now. My goal, again, part of the 2-year plan of the 4 years, the first 2 years is going to be focused on moving any, I don't know what we want to call them, but any wants, I'll call them the want projects, the ones that are wants but not needs for the city, and start pushing those to be taken over by private industry or to be done away with. It's not the government's job to give everybody what they want. You know what I mean? It's the government job to provide the basic needs, and for us to collectively, we do need to receive money from the residents so that we can do what's good collectively for the city, especially that's one of the reasons why public safety takes up 50% of our budget, because that's where the focus should be, on public service. I have not done a full audit of the city. My job as mayor is to help negotiate and get things done. It's not to be the problem solver on all of it. So the first part of me getting in there is to go in with the relationships that I already have, strengthen them even more, bring people to the table that can come up with ways for us to cut, period. Anything that is considered extra, honestly, shouldn't be the government's responsibility. And that's where I would start. So I don't like being reactive when it comes to running a business, which, you look at the city, it needs to be run just like a business would be run. And I don't like being reactive. I like being proactive on everything I possibly can be. I don't want to wait until we have a budget deficit and we have to figure something out last minute to make it work. I want to go in, I want to be able to create a smooth, efficient machine that is able to put excess money away and not have it earmarked for fluff projects for, a council members or the mayors.
I think that's important, because part of my flack with the city is around that bond election, right? Within a couple of weeks, I forget if it was like a couple of weeks before or a couple of weeks after, but they had us pass like $100 million in bonds, I think 66 of which went towards transportation, and then like the other 33 million went towards public safety, or vice versa. I'd have to double check. And then within that same, like that couple week period, either 2 weeks before or 2 weeks after, they allocated $50 million from the general fund, most of which went towards the pool. And I'm like, so basically what you did was you passed the bond to fund, like indirectly, right? Not directly, but indirectly. You passed the bond instead of taking money out of the general fund for transportation or money out of the general fund for public safety to build a water park. It's not the government's job to build a water.
Yeah, I haven't looked into the new pool, so I don't know everything about it. I'm not 100%
me limitedly.
Because here's how I think though. So if we are going to do something as a city like the pool, then it needs to be run like a business and it needs to be profitable, not fed off the backs of taxpayers. Does that make sense? So we need to charge for it.
It does. No, because it's an attraction. Right. And if you look at, say, what used to be Water World, was Wet and Wild, now is Six Flags Hurricane Harbor, or whatever the heck they call it. Right. It was always a private entity and they run it like a business. And trust and believe, they run it like a business. It's like $17 for a slice of pizza and a Coke. You know what I mean? Which is ludicrous. But it is what it is.
I'm not totally against projects like that being run by the
I'm
government.
not either, but it needs to be profitable.
It has to be run like a business and it has to be profitable. It cannot be at a deficit. What was the other one that's coming up?
Are you thinking like the music festival? that they were talking about trying to do another one?
No, yeah, and we lost so much money on that the last time.
We did, and I'm like, why? It's not the government's job to entertain me.
No, and again, I'm all for doing things like that as long as they're run profitable, as long as they're run like a business. And that's one of the issues that you get.
If we have a venue, you know what I mean? Like auction, right? For instance, which was Cricket Pavilion back in the day, right? Like that's a private entity that owns that land. The city collects the tax revenue on all of those sales, including your beer sales that are there, which is because the beers are like $24, you know, but so it's a revenue generation for the city and a win in that way. But the property is owned by a private entity, or if it is on city land, let's say, you can charge competitive rate, I guess I would say, without and still provide like, hey, it's the city owned land and the city's collecting not just the lease or the rent out of that facility, but whatever sales tax and whatnot there. But the city doesn't have to subsidize.
Yeah, I'm totally against any government subsidies whatsoever. I don't, you know, if the government got out of our way and left our money in our pocket, we wouldn't be having the issues that we are having economically. It's the government,
among other things, for sure.
Yeah. So my goal would be to turn this city more into running like an efficient business, rather than, because that's one of the issues of government is when the money just comes to you, you don't feel as much of a personal responsibility or an attachment to it. So you just spend it. You know, there's no other business on earth that runs the way the government does. I can't just go to my customers and go, hey, I'm forcing you. I'm just going to take it out of your paycheck to give me more money for my business. It's ludicrous that anything can even run like that. And the government definitely should not. There's no reason why a city couldn't be profitable and lessen the tax burden on the citizens by doing so. There's no reason it can't be. It was done before 1913 or 1912, whenever the government decided to pass the Income Tax Act. And I could go off on all that, but
no, I definitely could too. Like I'm in the libertarian camp of like abolish the IRS. So let's not get into that sort of a TED Talk. So there's 2 questions left. I'll give you the more fun one first. And then I think a good question to close it out is a little bit more serious, but still speaks or kind of piggybacks off of this. So if you could, let's just say like fantasy draft, city council and office for mayor and Surprise. I'm not necessarily looking for names, but what would the ideal group of people look like to run a government? And so whether it's a specific age range or group of age ranges, employment experience, professional backgrounds, anything of that nature, like what would you think would be the best course of action?
This is a great question. And the best answer for this is Mike Ditka was quoted as saying, give me a team of ordinary players who play together as a team and I'll give you a championship every year. Give me a team of superstars that won't work together and we'll lose every season. And I fully agree with that. So we actually have the best types of councils are the ones that are varied in age and in experience. I would say I wouldn't want to see anyone that was really under the age of 35 on there, because we need people with life experience to be making life decisions, not people that barely made it out of high school or whatever and they've never done anything in the bigger world and getting on there. They just end up voting for whatever they think they're told to vote for, and they can't fully think for themselves. They don't have the experience behind it. So people with real life experience. I'm not a big proponent of degree. I don't have a degree. I have enough credits that I could probably go back and get my bachelor's if I did my core stuff, but I cared about learning and knowledge. I've been mentored by some multi-billionaires and millionaires who taught me how to do business, who were my teachers and my professors. And I learned by doing. That's more of what we need brought, because there's, my business and accounting professor, I threw it out to him because he was teaching some things that weren't right. And I asked him, I said, what have you done business wise? He goes, what do you mean? I said, how many businesses have you run? He goes, I've never run a business. I go, you've never even started a business, or you've been a GM for someone else's business? And he goes, no. And I said, well, then how can you teach this? And he goes, I have a master's degree in business management. And I asked him this question and it didn't go well. But I said, do you know the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And he goes, they're the same thing. And I go, they're not. I said, knowledge is anything. I can tell you the sky is green, and that's knowledge. It's false knowledge, but it's knowledge. Wisdom is true knowledge that's left over after experience burns away false knowledge. And I said, all you have is stuff that you've learned and now you're regurgitating from a book. You have no wisdom, which pissed him off, even though it was true. We need people that are in here that are working and serving in the government that have wisdom, not knowledge, not just degrees, but wisdom. People that have taken knowledge, applied it, and created success with it to come in and serve. So I don't have necessarily an age range, but I don't think until by the time I was 30 years old, I had already served in the Army. I had already been homeless, actually, at one time, had to rebuild my life, and was in the music industry as a singer and a songwriter. By the time I was 30, I had accomplished more in 30 years than a lot of people do in a lifetime. I mean, I was on shows, I was performing in front of people. I still, even with all the life experience I had at 30, look back and think I was too young to serve in the capacity of mayor or councilman. I think you just, again, life experience is what matters to me. You know, like we had Dave Sanders in there. Dave Sanders was a very soft-spoken individual, a very well-spoken individual, and was a numbers guy, right? That's one of the things I respected about him and that he brought to the council that was awesome that we needed on council. I'd like to see a numbers guy back on the council. Yeah, I love Haney and his, public service background. I could go on about each one of them. I do have relationships with each one of them, but we need people with life experience. And again, I think there's a wealth of people here in Surprise that we can draw from each of the districts to not only step up and become elected officials, but to take part in these committees that we have out there. I don't know if that means expanding the size of the committees of people that are allowed on them or whatnot, but I think we're wasting a wealth of wisdom from a lot of our residents that are out there. So I don't know how else to answer that. Definitely a number.
No, I mean, it was literally just to take the question and run with it, whatever you think, right? And I think, honestly, the Mike Ditka quote speaks volumes, right? And, your comments about knowledge versus, I don't know who originally conceptualized this, but it's an even more dumbed down version of that. And it's like, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting ketchup in a fruit smoothie. And then philosophy is wondering if ketchup in and of itself is a smoothie because it's blended tomatoes. So, I mean, it's funny and it's a very simple analogy.
No, it works.
But it works, right? Because I'm like, I'm a big proponent of devil's advocate, right? I'm like, prove me wrong that ketchup isn't a smoothie, because what is a smoothie if not blended fruit with some sort of viscous liquid, right? Like that's what it is. So the final question, and then we can wrap up. And if you have any, questions for me or what have you, by all means. But the last question is that our city is full, like you said, of a very diverse group of people with vast variations of opinions, etc.
Yep.
And their opinions often run the gamut as far as what they feel the major foci should be of our local government and how to solve those issues. So what is your opinion, and what restrictions, if any, should be placed on the residents' right to express those opinions and concerns? And you can take that with, down the sign avenue, like was in the media not too long ago. You take that down to public opinion and public comment at public meetings, however you want. Like, how do you think as a government we balance all of that?
Well, first off, I don't believe the government has any right to tell you what you can and can't say, period. Never should. Nothing should ever be censored. I believe that people will create their own karma in their own life, and they need to be allowed to do that. So making, putting restrictions on speech is an absolute no-no. I will fight tooth and nail against that, even if I completely disagree with anyone. And I'll tell you a great story along the lines. And this is something that I did. So when the Black Lives Matter started putting out there that they were going to protest at Litchfield and Bell, I reached out to the one guy that was mostly on social media saying that they're going to be on the corner and they're going to be heard and they're going to be, and I messaged him and I said, hey brother, I appreciate your right to be out there to protest and to get, your views out there. It's over there by my restaurant though. And I have family and employees that are there. Can you just promise me that it's going to stay, it's not going to turn into the rioting that we have in other cities? And the kid's response to me was, F that. If we got to get violent to be heard, we're going to get violent to hurt. And I said, okay, just so you understand, I and several other veterans will be there armed. And, I want to come over and at least say hi to you before this starts so we can make sure this stays peaceful. It doesn't need to get violent. And I walked over there, and as I'm walking up, this kid steps in front of me and goes, go back to your people. And I was like, what are you talking about? So I pushed him aside and I walked to the back where there were some folks that were more in their 30s and 40s because who looked like they were setting it up. And what ended up happening was almost an hour and a half of some fantastic conversation with these people. Great conversation. Like, we got along, we laughed. There's a bunch of things in Surprise that we loved, that we were happy with. Some of the things that we were unhappy with, we agreed on. And I looking over, there was only 4 people that were really being antagonists on the Black Lives Matter side. And same thing on they were calling it the Blue Lives Matter. On the other side, there was only 4 people that were being antagonists over there. The majority of the people were actually fine. You know what I mean? but there was just these instigators walking around. So anyways, I decided, okay, I'm going to go over to the other side and talk to them to make sure, everything stays kosher. And as I'm walking across the street, this lady steps in front of me and goes, "What are you doing over here? Go back to your people." And the lady next to her goes, "This is Ed Cunningham. This is the Firehouse Subs guy. He's the one that did the post about this going on tonight." And she goes, "Well, what the hell were you doing over there?" And I said, "Lady, I was building bridges." I go, "It's people like you that are causing these problems. People like me, people like them." And she starts, going off and everything. And again, I walked right past her and went back to talk to the people that were kind of being the instigators. And again, the majority of the crowd were actually really well behaved on both sides. The next week that they were talking about protesting again, the police reached out to me and said, "Hey, Ed, would you mind going out and making sure that the Blue Lives Matter go over to the Buffalo Wild Wings corner? That way there's 2 crosswalks between the groups." And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I'll get out there and I'll make sure everybody sets up the way, they should." There was some contention going on, and it was really kind of an odd feeling out there. So after the second one of the Blue Lives Matter guys and myself and the lady that was putting together the Black Lives Matter, we all went to lunch. We reached out to each other and said, "Let's get together and talk." We spent 3 hours at the Sonic at Cotton and Greenway talking. And we found out that 90% of the way we believe is the same. We love family. We love community. We love surprise. Because at first it was like, government does this. And I said, okay, well, we can't do anything federal. We can't even do a lot on the state level. Let's just talk about surprise. And after 3 hours, some tears, a little bit of contention here and there, we walked away, all 3 of us, great friends. The next week when they had protesting that went on, it was a totally different vibe. Like, we were doing dance-offs back and forth from corner to corner. There was some cheering. I actually made up a whole bunch of subs and brought it over to Black Lives Matter. They had a bunch of pizzas and brought it over to Blue Lives Matter. And this group of college kids who brought the pizzas over, there's probably like 7 or 8 of them, sat there for 45 minutes and they said, "Hey, respectfully, I know we may not agree, but we're willing to answer any questions that you guys have about what we believe and the things that we want to have." The conversation was amazing. 45 minutes of these college kids and some of these older people just getting together, and there were hugs at the end of it. And then that was it. The protesting ended. And that's what we need more of. People that can get people who are opposing each other to sit down, to find the commonalities. And that's why I keep calling myself the bridge builder. And I know other candidates have started using it in their speeches too, but I truly have been building bridges in here in Surprise for over a decade. And that is what we need in the office of mayor.
No, and I would definitely agree that you need to be able to see both sides of the issues and remove your emotion or your bias or whatever it is with it. And it does take a very specific skill set to do this. I remember, speaking of the Black Lives Matter, when that kind of first conceptualized in the mainstream media, social media, etc., several years back, I remember a lot of people got mad at the church that I was attending. The senior pastor got up and gave a sermon about loving your neighbor even when you don't love what they're saying. And something that he said during that was that when somebody who's Black gets up and says, Black Lives Matter, raises their fist, power to the people, Malcolm X type stuff, he didn't use those words, but that what you would stereotypically think to be in that vein. And obviously I'm very white, so it's not my place, not my space to say how somebody should behave or how they should feel. If they feel like their rights are being suppressed, that's their lens, right? But what is it helpful for me as a white person, or is it helpful for me as somebody who may be in law enforcement or has, law enforcement family or whatever other different lens than somebody who feels that they are actively being oppressed or marginalized? Is it helpful for me to say, well, white lives matter or blue lives matter or brown lives matter? It's not. You're just further adding fuel to the fire and adding more contention. And that was part of what his parting thoughts were in that sermon. And I think that if we get back to that mentality and build bridges and understand that just because, and like I said before, right, I'm a libertarian, so I believe in what most people would say radical free speech. I mean, you're not necessarily free from consequences. You can't go and say bomb an airplane, fire in a movie theater, stuff like that, and create some sort of panic. And you also I can't be like, Ed, meet me in the parking lot, I'm going to fight you, or I'm going to stab you or whatever.
I don't know. We might need to bring that back in the day.
I think some people, you know what I mean? If you made, coming to blows with somebody, if you know what I mean? Hey, everybody gets one free shot. I feel like some people might reconsider what they say, but sure, my right to punch you ends where your nose begins. But you know what I mean? You're not free from those consequences.
Yeah.
And you may say something that I don't agree with, and I don't believe it myself, but I'll fight to the death for you to have the right to say it. And if we just put those feelings aside and get back to...
Well, and it's when you have 2 people talking at each other, nothing's getting accomplished. one has to actually take the time to listen. And then once you've listened enough, the other person almost always, this is how I win almost every negotiation I go into, is I spend the first, I don't know, however long it takes, hour, 2 hours of any meeting that I walk into, if I'm negotiating something, asking questions. That's it. I don't talk. I don't talk at, you know what I mean? Or I might do a little bit here and there just to clarify.
I do the same time, same thing when I have a difficult customer at work. I'm like, okay, so you're communicating back and forth, maybe that you have concerns. What concerns do you have? Because this is the objective that we're trying to achieve.
And that's something that I want to bring, that I did exceptionally well at Firehouse. It's one of the reasons why we were one of the highest grossing in the nation, one of the highest ranked in the nation, why we had almost no turnover of employees compared to most of the other restaurants. The number one reason people left working for us was because they graduated high school and moved off to college, which is unheard of in the quick serve restaurant industry.
Yeah, that is very unheard of. Usually those are high turnover.
Very much. I'm one of the only ones that I knew of, one of the only owners that didn't budget for turnover, because we hardly had any. And that came from what I call the servant style of leadership. That I would like to also bring even more. So we actually have Bob Wingeroff, who's our city manager, is amazing at servant style leadership, and had a great conversation with him quite a while ago about that when he was coming back to be our city manager. And I am totally on board with it. I would love to create that completely inundated throughout the city, is the servant style of leadership. Not this, I'm above you telling you what to do, but I'm here with you at your level or even below you, lifting you up to do your job. And that needs to, when you focus on that, on the core of your business or the core of your organization, to have that kind of leadership, it just ripples out into the community, into the customers, and you can see that. I'm one of the few franchises that never paid for local retail market, yet I was still one of the highest grossing in the nation. And that came from because of the feel you got when you walked into the restaurant. And it wasn't me, that was my employees. That was because me and my cousin, who both ran the restaurant, focused on our employees and their experience. Now, we still held them to high standard. We still had very high standard, but we encouraged them to be responsible and to be servant leaders themselves to each other and to the customers that came in. That is easy, simple, I'll say, not easy, but that's simple to scale to an organization the size of a city, especially our city.
No, and I think those are all really good takeaways in trying to balance the different interests. You know, like the expression goes, like, you can please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. You know, balancing that and then just making sure everyone feels and is heard, I think are crucial.
Yeah.
So I know we've been a little over time on.
All right. Well, I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I will talk to you later.
Thank you, Rebekah.
All right. Well, hopefully you all found this as interesting as I did to hear directly from the candidates on some thought-provoking questions. I know personally I was pretty excited at the chance and the opportunity and just the overall willingness from the 4 folks that graciously participated, be able to hear from them, right, in some less formal circumstances than we would typically come across them in the community, say at a council meeting or what have you. It was great to just have a human-to-human, person-to-person type of a conversation on what their views are, what they bring to the table, where they see the city going, vision for the future, and most importantly, how, despite any differences in vision, politics, viewpoints, how we all come together and move forward as a community, and how they move forward, the new folks that are going to be in office early next year, move together as a governing body to serve our city. If you haven't already, I do encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to the Grand Failure Beyond the Streets podcast, as well as, of course, give a listen to our previous episodes, and even more importantly, all 4 of these episodes in our special mini series, which once again, I am aptly dubbing as the candidates. Don't forget to tune in after the election. So sometime in August here, right around the corner, if you can believe that, I'm going to be wrapping up the very first exciting season of the Grand Failure podcast. This is your host, Rebekah Massie, signing off for now, and I will see you at the polls on July 30th. Surprise. Take care.
You're listening to The Grand Failure Beyond the Streets, a podcast about the ongoing public safety crisis in Surprise, Arizona.
The Grand Failure podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by Rebekah Massie. Jonathan Perry is credited with the voiceover and announcement work. I'd like to thank Spotify for podcasters as the hosting and distribution platform, and the folks over at Audacity for the open source software that made production and editing of this podcast possible. Any graphics, logos, or artwork used to promote or identify the podcast was created by Rebekah Massie herself using the Canva software program. Sound effects and music are provided courtesy of freesound.org unless otherwise noted, and Freesound is a website that offers royalty-free Community Commons licenses for a variety of soundbites, songs, and effects. I'd like to take a moment to give my heartfelt thanks and appreciation for each and every candidate that participated in this mini-series, and specifically those are Councilmember Patrick Duffy, Mr. Johnny Melton, Mr. Ed Cunningham, and Mr. Kevin Sartor. Any sources, news articles, or other information, including the candidates' websites, if available, will be linked on the webpage dedicated to the Grand Failure podcast on thegrandfailure.org. That's thegrandfailure.org. I'd also like to thank the local political action committee, or PAC, by the name of Voice of Surprise, for their partnership and my efforts on this podcast, as well as give a quick shout out and thank you to my husband, Mr. Brian Massey, who has graciously put up with my work on this endeavor. Thank you all for your time, and for all of the podcast credits, details, and information, head on over to my website, thegrandfailure.org.